Apparently this group is much friendlier over here. So if you guys could just... So I'm on day 3 of 5 of being a single dad. Rachel is at a work conference in New Orleans. So this morning I walked in. People are like, well, how's it going? I'm like, well, I still have 2 out of the 3, so I'm doing pretty good for that. But she is in New Orleans. She sent me a prayer request, so I'd appreciate if you guys would pray with that. She said there are Patriots fans everywhere down there. So, Russell, where are you at, buddy? I know, there are Patriots fans out there. It's just proof, Russell, you being here, that we accept all kinds of broken people here at Community Church of Waterford. And we're just going to love you right where you're at, Russell. Right where you're at, buddy. You'll come around. So, we're in week number 3 of our series called My Story. And what we've been doing in this series is we've been taking a look at one key word each week that can be a complete game changer for the kind of story that our lives convey to the rest of the world. We all have chapters from our past that we're more proud of than others, and we all have chapters that we would love to take back if we could. And while we can't change the past, we have a big, big God who can redeem our past. And he can take those bad, hurtful chapters and he can turn those into the greatest ones yet to be written in your life if we allow him to become the author instead of us. And our theme verse for this series has been out of Hebrews 12, verse 2, where it says, "Fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith." And to write the best story possible with our life, we need to focus on Jesus instead of ourselves, because as we've been saying through this series, when we become the author, our stories just end up becoming me stories. But when we decide to let God be the author of our story, when we surrender our lives to him, when we hand over the pen and paper, something amazing begins to happen. And our story starts to shift gears. And instead of being a me story, it becomes a look at how great and powerful and awesome and loving our God is kind of a story. And when God becomes the author, people take notice because they see something different than what they're used to seeing in the world around them. They see a story with a bigger purpose. They see a story with a grander vision, a compelling story. They see a story that's inspirational, and they see a story that is worth telling. And when we allow God to be the author of our story, he uses us to draw others to himself through the amazing life stories that he writes in us and that he writes through us. And in week 1, we realized that to write a story worth telling, God wants us to start. And this word was all about the decision to start a habit or discipline that can be life transforming. Because the reality, as we talked about, was that there are certain habits, there are certain disciplines that when you practice those habits and disciplines consistently, they have this way of spilling forward into positive momentum into different areas of your lives. But in the same way, the absence of those same habits and disciplines can cause your undisciplined lifestyle to unravel and spiral out of control. Last week, we looked at our second word, which was stop. All of us have something going on in our life that is not good for our future story. And if we don't stop it now, we can fast forward our stories and see that they don't end well, or certainly not as well as they could have, if we decided today to stop something so that we would have a different story to tell in the future. The decisions that we make today determine the stories that we tell tomorrow. And it's the actual direction that we are heading, not our intentions, that will determine the destination that we arrive at in the future. Our focus word for today is going to be stay. And as we focus on our word for today, we realize that during this season of life that we're in, we're going to run up against some obstacles or challenges. It might be a job that you don't feel like you could stand anymore. It might be a relationship that's falling apart. It may be a goal that you're trying to achieve, but it's just gotten so difficult you're considering throwing in the towel. And in all of these situations, you have to decide, do I stay the course or do I walk away? Now let's acknowledge there are certain times where we should walk away from a situation or circumstance in our lives. There are times in our lives where we need to let a chapter end and start a new chapter. But far too often, people walk away before they ever really sought out God's wisdom and insight into the situation. They walk away because it just feels too hard. And what I want us to focus on today is that many times the best decision that you can make is to stay the course when it would be easier to walk away. I remember when I was in college, my senior year, I was elected the president of the music group that I was in. And was terrible at it. Anybody remember like the first time you got a leadership role and it was one of those chapters you want to rip out, right? Kind of a thing. I was terrible. It just went to me. I'm like, ooh, Presidente. All right. I'm just like all that, it just kind of went to my head. And I wasn't thinking about others. I wasn't putting others' needs first. It was like, this is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And what I ended up doing was I alienated the rest of the officers of that group. And it got to a place where it finally I woke up to it, and I was so embarrassed about that. And I felt like I had done so much damage to that. And there was another music group on campus that had been saying, hey, just come over and join our group. And I got really close to doing that because it would have been so much easier just to walk away. You ever do that? You just want to start fresh. We think we can get a clean slate, right? Doesn't work that way. But we just look at it and go, man, if I stay here, I have to deal with all of this now that I created. But I have to sit here and deal with all of this stuff. It'd be so much easier to just be like, I'm done. I'm just going to go over here and start in a new group, and hopefully this goes better. Right? And fortunately, I had this great advisor, Dr. Bibza, that came to me and really challenged me on that. Said, Chris, you cannot walk away every time life gets tough. You cannot walk away every time you're in a leadership position and things get tough. You need to stay put. You need to stay the course. And fortunately, with having that wisdom spoken into my life, I decided to do that. And I stayed. And instead of taking the easy route out, I went back and I sat down one by one with each of these other officers, apologized for my stupidity, apologized for my arrogance, asked for their forgiveness, and worked on restoring the trust in those relationships. Was that easy to do? No. Did that take some time to do? Absolutely. But I was so blessed because I chose to stay instead of taking the easy route out. And I wonder, in the season of life you're in right now, how many of you are making a similar decision? Do I stay or do I walk away? And how you answer that question after seeking guidance from God and others who love God and love you is going to determine the story that you tell tomorrow. Some of you might not be in that place right now in life where you feel you have one of these big stay or walk away decisions. But if you don't have one now, you know one's coming in the not too distant future, don't you? Whichever situation you're in, we all want to be able to make the wise, God-honoring decisions, the God-honoring choice, because the decisions we make today determine the story that we will tell tomorrow. There's a great example of a stay or walk away idea in the book of Ruth, which is a part of the Old Testament portion of the Bible, and that's the part of the Bible that tells about the history of God and his people from creation until Jesus came to earth. And in the book of Ruth, we read about a woman named Naomi, who along with her husband had moved from the land of Judah to the land of Moab. And after arriving in Moab, both of her sons married women from Moab. And over the course of the next 10 years or so, Naomi's husband and both of her sons die. So all that's left were Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And in the culture of that day, it was nearly impossible for women to support themselves, so they essentially became beggars. And Naomi decided that the best thing to do now was to go back to her homeland of Judah in Bethlehem. And her two daughter-in-laws started the journey with her, but as they continued on, Naomi realized that the best future for her daughter-in-laws was for them to return home to their land of Moab and find husbands there among their people, not to continue to stay with an old widow like herself who didn't have any other sons for them to marry. And the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, decided that was the right thing to do. No shame in it. That was the easy thing to do. That was the logical thing to do. It made sense. But Ruth decided to do something very different. She decided to stay when it would have been so much easier for her to go. When encouraged by her mother-in-law to return to Moab, this is what Ruth had to say. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." In other words, she's saying, I know it would be easier to walk away, but I'm choosing to stay. You're my family now. This is worth fighting for. It makes sense to walk away, but I'm deciding to stay. And that decision by Ruth was a costly decision because now she found herself a stranger in a foreign land. And as I mentioned earlier, she was a beggar, which in those days was actually a step down from being a slave. So here's what would happen. In order to get food for her and her mother-in-law, Ruth would go into the harvest fields and she would follow after the workers in the field and she would pick up any scrap food that was accidentally left behind. And if she found scraps, then the two of them got to eat. But if she didn't, they would go hungry. It was a very dangerous way to survive being a single woman hanging around the fields with all the males all around the place working in the fields because it was a risk of her being taken advantage of or hurt. And we go on in the book of Ruth to read about a man named Boaz, this wealthy man of integrity and faith who owned a great deal of land and he had many workers. And he was a relative on Naomi's deceased husband's side of the family. And one day while he's out in his fields checking on his workers, Boaz sees this gal following behind his workers, picking up the scraps. And he inquires about who she is, and he discovers that she returned to Bethlehem with Naomi after both of their husbands died. So Boaz orders his men to not hurt her in any way and to leave extra food scraps behind for her intentionally and to provide water for her whenever she needed it as she worked during the course of the day. And he also instructed Ruth to only collect food from the fields that he owned so that she would always be safe. And the reason Boaz did all of this was because he had heard Ruth's story. After all, the decision that she had made up to that point were the decisions that were telling the story that she was sharing about her life at that point. And when she asked him why he was showing such favor to her, this is what we're told. Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And neither one of them at that time had any idea just how big the blessing was going to end up being for both of them. Because through a series of unusual events, Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. And suddenly this girl who had no future whatsoever, by making the faithful decision to stay, now becomes one of two women who had books of the Bible named after her. And even more significant is that if you trace back through the lineage of Jesus Christ, you will see that he came from her bloodline. Sometimes choosing to stay can make all the difference. Her whole life has changed. Why? Because she decided to stay when it would have been easier to go. Now, don't miss the power of this, because she didn't stay hoping God would bless her. She stayed because she believed it was right, and God blessed her because she did what was right. And all of us at some point in our lives, we're going to come to this crossroad, and we're going to have to make a decision. Should I stay the course when it would be easier to just walk away? And the big question that we've been asking in this series has been, what does God want you to want? What does God want you to want? And we've talked about possibilities here. It may be that he wants you to spend more time with your family. It may be that he wants you to grow more spiritually. Some of you, it may be to stop pursuing your own dreams and surrender something to God. Or it may be to stop living for things that don't matter. It might be to spend more time at home. That list can go on and on. Whatever it is, what does God want you to want? It's a question that you have to wrestle with, and you have to see how God stirs in your soul. And then in light of determining what God wants for you, our application question for today is, where does God want you to stay? Where does God want you to stay? Where does God want you to stay the course so that you can live the story that God wants you to tell? Where does God want you to stay the course when it would be so much easier to walk away? Now, I wish Rachel was here today because I like doting on my wife in front of other people. But she's gone, and I'm going to do it anyway because she can listen later on, right? We moved here, just beginning of August was 7 years that I've been here at CCW. And Rachel worked at Goshen Hospital for the first year that we were here. And then she started to work for Oaklawn. And she's been there ever since. But when Rachel started, and I forget where that was. I didn't want to bug her for all the details while she's out this weekend. I forget what office she was at. did not start well at all. It was one of the, you ever start a job and within like a week you're going, should have thought that through a little bit better. Anybody ever have one of those kinds of jobs? Things just did not go well when she first got started at all. She was very frustrated. Everything just seemed disorganized. I'm sure none of you have this, and my staff better not raise their hand, but a boss who just doesn't know what they're doing. So, but you know what I'm talking about. There's people who just shouldn't be bosses, right? That's just the reality of that. Shouldn't have been a boss, and she felt like everything was getting dumped on her. I mean, like the first month was just horrible. And it would have been so easy for her to just walk away. It would have been so easy for her to leave. I would have totally supported it. But Rachel knew that her life wasn't her own. And that she was never intended to be the author. So she sought out the author's story instead of her own. And she felt that it was God's will for her to stay. And I can't help but think of the end of the verses that I just read a little bit ago, where Boaz says, "May God bless you for what you have done. May God bless you for the decision you've made. May God bless you for being obedient, for following his plan, for letting him write your story." And she went on to serve as a nurse with Oaklawn for the next 5 years, and the last 3 of which she sensed another chapter starting in her life, which required her to go back to grad school for 3 years, which if you've ever gone back to school at all, you know there's always stay or walk away stories there, don't you? And now she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner. Now she is investing day after day into the lives of children who need some extra help to thrive. And sometimes I can't help but think, what if she had just walked away 6 years ago? What if she had just decided to take the easier route? What would her story be today if she had? I'm so glad she stayed. And I believe the children that she serves are blessed because she stayed. And I think God has honored Rachel's faithfulness and blessed her because of that. And as a result, I've been blessed because I'm the guy who has the privilege of being her hubby. There are going to be times in your lives where the way forward doesn't look easy, where another path will seem to look so much more appealing and so much easier. But there are going to be many of those times where God is going to call you to stay the course when you would rather go a different direction. And in light of what God wants you to want, where does God want you to stay? Maybe you're working and you're taking classes at the same time and you've gotten to the point where you just don't feel like you can keep going. It's just too hard. It's too expensive. It's too time consuming. It's just too much. And you're tempted to walk away. But your life is more than just you. It's about how God wants to use you. And when you seek out his will and his plan for your life right now, you realize that the best thing you can do is stay and continue to work hard and persevere to graduation. God will honor that faithfulness if that's what he's called you to. And as a result of that, your future story will be better tomorrow because you decided to stay today. What about those who are tempted to give up on church? That happens all the time. They get their feelings hurt. They feel like they've been wronged. The easy route would just to be say, forget this, I'm out of here. And far too many people take that easy route instead of taking the more difficult route of staying and working through the issues. Because let's face it, the church is full of broken, messed up people, Patriots fans. So of course, there are going to be some issues along. I love you, Russell. There's going to be some issues along the way. That's the way it is with any family, right? So if you ever find a church that is perfect, please don't join it because you will screw it up. Hashtag truth, all right? But then there are others who make the decision to stay anyways. They know that That is where God is calling them to be at this season in life, and they do the work necessary to repair the relationships and clear the air on what's going on and seek to grow as a result of it. And I have seen God bless that decision over and over and over again in my years of ministry. Those people are some of the healthiest people I know in faith because they persevered when it would have been so much easier to walk away. For some people, they've taken the walk away steps in their relationship with God. Something happened in life and they've decided, God, if you're going to let this happen when you could have stopped it, then forget you. And your story can be that you walked away from God just like people all over the world are doing. God, if you're going to let that happen, I can't believe in you anymore. Or you might decide to stay with God, as God will always stay with you because he has promised to never leave us nor forsake us. And so you tell him, I don't understand it. This doesn't make sense to me. But God, I realize that I'm not God and you are. So I'm choosing to believe in you even when I don't sense your presence. And when time goes on and something happens inside of you and you start to look back at that thing that you hated and you realize, I didn't know it at the time, but oh my gosh, God actually used that in my life to make me different. And what the enemy meant for evil, somehow God used for good. And now I'm living for him and for his glory in a way that I never thought possible. And this is my story because I decided to stay with God when it would have been easier to walk away because I didn't understand. Some of you, it's going to be in your marriage. And let me just say two quick things before I talk about your marriage. Number one, I don't want to make anybody feel guilty about past chapters in your story. Because we can't change the past. We've talked about that, haven't we? But God can redeem the past. And number two, if you're in a situation where you're being abused, if someone is beating you, I'm not telling you to stay and be a punching bag either. You need to get away from that. You need to get to a place that's safe where you can get healthy, where they can become healthy, and then you can work on that marriage in a healthy way. But I'm not telling you to stay and let somebody hit you. But over and over and over again in our society today, we see one or the other spouse say, you know what? I'm not very happy. So let's just cash it in. He's not meeting my needs, and the trainer at the gym, he sure compliments me a lot, or she's kind of boring, and the girl at work, she's kind of fun, so I'm just walking away from this. He didn't make me happy. I mean, we gave it a shot for a little while, but it just didn't work out. And when your marriage gets to that point, it's a struggle because we all get there in our marriages because we're all sinful, broken, messed up people. But when you get to that point, you need to ask yourself, what story do you want to tell? Well, kids, we gave it a shot for a while, but we just weren't happy. And that can be your story, and unfortunately, it's a lot of people's story. Or your story might go like this. You know what? We didn't like each other. We hated each other. We didn't believe in murder, so we just prayed that the other one would somehow die. Right? I mean, it was horrible. Like, you wouldn't believe it. It was the worst thing ever. But you know what? We made a covenant before our God, so we hung in there. And we got counseling, and we got help, and we made church a priority, and we got into a life group where other people were able to speak into our lives, and it didn't happen overnight, but over a period of time, God started to change us. And now we have a marriage. It's not perfect, but we've gone 40 years, kids, because we believe a covenant is something that is important. And God has given us something that we didn't think was possible. And God will give you a tremendous story tomorrow because you made the more difficult decision to stay today when it seemed far easier to just walk away. You know, I think of my parents. I did not have, I don't know how some of you are, but I did not have a very good relationship with my parents growing up at all. My dad was a workaholic. He was gone all the time. I don't remember him being involved in a whole lot of stuff. My mom grew up, and as a kid, sometimes you don't get this. You don't recognize how much what your parents went through growing up affected how they parented you. And my mom grew up in a horrible situation. Her dad was very abusive. And a lot of times that's how we learn how to parent, is watching our parents, right? Because that's all we have, some of us. So she didn't know how to parent, and she naturally just would get verbally abusive with everything. Got to the place, so I couldn't stand my mom. This is just me being real here, guys. It got to a point where I got a younger brother, older sister. It got to a place where we just hoped that Dad would walk away. Like, we wanted Dad to walk away. We thought the way he got treated was just like garbage, and we just wanted him to walk away. And there was never a moment in my dad's mind where he even considered that as being an option. And then my mom had a massive stroke in the late 80s. She had a tumor in her heart. A piece of it broke off and went to her brain and caused a stroke. And I watched my dad step up. In some pretty amazing ways. Ways that make it embarrassing for me to look back at that and think that I wished at one point that he would leave her. But Dad decided to stay, even in the worst years. Now my parents are retired. They live in North Carolina, and they're both 77 this year. Dad got diagnosed with dementia a couple of years ago, and he's definitely fading. And that's hard to watch. And now I see my mom as she goes through the struggle. And again, not for a moment would she think to leave, because they had made decisions years and years before that no matter how bad it got, they were going to stay. And because of that, my parents celebrated 56 years of marriage this year. And they get to tell that story because all those years before, they had made the decision to stay. All of you, whether it's 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 56 years from now, your life is going to tell a story. What story do you want your life to tell? I don't know what area of your life you need to apply today's message to, but I want you to know this beyond a shadow of a doubt, that sometimes the greatest act of faith is faithfulness. Staying where you are planted. The decisions that we make today determine the stories that we will tell tomorrow. And sometimes the best decision that you can make is to stay when it would be so much easier to walk away.